On a quiet Saturday afternoon in a small southern town, where the air carried the faint scent of magnolia and freshly mown grass, Elijah Freeman stepped out of his modest home for his usual walk, a ritual he'd kept for decades, a daily affirmation that life, no matter how long or hard, was still worth facing. At 90 years old, Elijah was no ordinary man. He was a living testament to courage and resilience, a black veteran who had survived 3 brutal wars and carried the weight of history on his shoulders. His body, though bent with age, bore the proud marks of a lifetime of service. His World veteran's jacket was immaculately clean-pressed, its faded patches and medals quietly telling stories of battles fought and sacrifices made. On his head sat a well-worn cap, its fabric softened by years but still a symbol of honor and dignity. As he walked slowly but deliberately down the cracked sidewalk, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete, the neighborhood seemed to pause briefly, a momentary respect for the man who had once marched across foreign fields, who had faced gunfire and death without flinching. But respect was in short supply on this particular afternoon. A cluster of teenagers, aimless and loud, hung out near the corner store, their faces flushed with the reckless energy of youth and boredom. They saw Elijah as nothing more than an old man, a relic they could mock without consequence. They shouted cruel words, jeering and laughing, calling him just another old man, as if the decades of valor that shaped his soul were invisible to them. Their voices rose in disrespectful crescendos, mocking the steady courage that Elijah embodied. The youngest, boldest among them, moved closer, eyes wild with misplaced bravado, and shoved him. The shove was not just physical, it was a slap against everything Elijah had stood for, a violent dismissal of his life's meaning. He stumbled, his body old but not broken, falling hard onto the unforgiving concrete. Pain lanced through his elbow, skin scraping raw, but it was the shock that hung heavier in the air. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Even the teenagers froze, stunned by what they had done, by the undeniable truth that their actions had crossed a line. Elijah lay there briefly, the weight of years pressing down, but then with a slow, deliberate movement, he pushed himself up. There was no cry for help, no outburst of anger. Only a calm, unyielding strength radiated from his eyes, steel forged in the fires of war. He met their gazes without fear, without hatred, just the quiet power of a man who had seen too much to be shaken by juvenile cruelty. Without a word, he turned and walked away, each step heavy but resolute, leaving the stunned group behind. He didn't yell or curse. Those were weapons he no longer needed. Instead, as the distance grew between him and the teenagers, he pulled out his phone, a relic as old as himself, and dialed a number that would set events in motion far beyond this street corner. That call was more than just a message. It was a summons for justice, a gathering of warriors bound not by time or place but by honor and loyalty. In that moment, Elijah Freeman was not just a 90-year-old man who had been shoved. He was the spark that ignited a force the teenagers had never imagined, a living legend who would remind them that respect is earned and that some men, no matter how old, should never be underestimated. Elijah Freeman's phone was a relic, an old model that barely kept up with the modern world, but it still worked. Sometimes that was all you needed. And with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened, he dialed a number he had only ever used twice in his life, a number that belonged to a man who was both family and soldier, Sergeant Major Daniel Brooks, his godson, a fiercely loyal Marine on active duty stationed several states away. The moment the call connected, the voice on the other end answered without hesitation, "Uncle Eli," the tone carrying a mixture of surprise and concern that quickly shifted to steel as Elijah explained the situation in quiet, measured words. By the time the last syllable left Elijah's lips, Sergeant Major Brooks was already in action, making calls to trusted contacts, relaying precise coordinates, activating a network of Marines who owed their lives or careers to the man now disrespected on a dusty street corner. Word traveled fast, faster than the rumors that often plagued the Marine Brotherhood. For this wasn't just any old man. This was Elijah Freeman, a living legend whose name was whispered with reverence in training camps and barracks alike. The man who had saved countless lives in Korea, led fearless units through the jungles of Vietnam, and mentored generation after generation of Marines to uphold the highest values of honor and courage. Within minutes, as the teenagers laughed and jeered, unaware that their petty cruelty was about to provoke a storm, the first Marines arrived, some in unmarked Humvees, others on powerful motorcycles that rumbled like thunder down the streets, all clad in a mix of dress uniforms, combat fatigues, and streetwear, their presence undeniable and commanding. There was no room for hesitation or violence, only the unyielding message that respect was not optional, and that some men, like Elijah Freeman, carried a legacy that demanded recognition, a legacy woven with sacrifice and valor. And as the crowd of Marines grew, converging silently but surely around the block where the teens had gathered, the energy shifted, the laughter dying to uneasy whispers, and then silence, because the Marines were not there to fight, but to teach a lesson in respect, to remind a generation too often lost in bravado and ignorance that history does not forget, that heroes do not fade quietly into the night, and that sometimes the old warriors rise again, not with guns drawn, but with the power of presence, solidarity, and an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of battle. Elijah Freeman's call had awakened a force far greater than the sum of its parts, a brotherhood. That transcended time and circumstance, and 20 minutes after that shove, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the quiet town, the teenagers who had dared to disrespect a war hero found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and, faced with a truth that could not be ignored, you had picked the wrong man. The teenagers didn't notice the first Marine slipping quietly into the street, blending almost seamlessly with the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun, nor the second, as he positioned himself strategically by a lamppost. By the time the 6th and 7th Marines had arrived, their numbers swelling and forming a loose but unmistakable perimeter around the group, the teens' boisterous laughter and careless jeers began to falter, an uneasy silence creeping in as they sensed something different, something ominous stirring in the air. These were not just uniformed men, but warriors built like iron, their eyes sharp and scanning, their presence so commanding it seemed to drain the bravado right out of the youths standing before them. And then one stepped forward from the ranks, tall and broad-shouldered. Sergeant Major Daniel Brooks himself, Elijah Freeman's godson, his voice low and gravelly, like thunder rolling over distant hills as he fixed his gaze on the teenagers, and asked in a tone that brooked no argument, "Which one of you touched my uncle?" There was no answer, just the heavy quiet as the teens looked around at one another, the gravity of the situation dawning on them like a cold shadow. For now they realized they were surrounded by more than 24 Marines, men and women, from every walk of life, standing shoulder to shoulder, not with weapons drawn, but with the unyielding strength of unity and purpose. Sergeant Major Brooks took a slow, deliberate step closer, his eyes piercing, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury as he continued. "You didn't just shove an old man. You shoved a hero, a man who bled for this country before your parents were born. You picked the wrong man." And in that moment the air was thick with a powerful silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words. As the Marines stood tall around Elijah Freeman, who himself stood quietly nearby, a pillar of resilience and grace, and the teens, once reckless and loud, now understood the weight of their actions, surrounded by the very embodiment of courage and honor, forced to face the truth that some lines once crossed awaken forces far beyond their reckoning, and that respect, once denied, would be fiercely demanded by those who carry the torch of sacrifice and history. What followed was not violence, but a profound reckoning in truth and honor that transformed the very air around them. The Marines, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah Freeman, began to share stories, raw and unvarnished, about the man they revered. Tales of bravery under fire when bullets tore through jungles in Vietnam and enemy ambushes threatened to wipe out entire squads until Elijah's quick thinking and fearless leadership saved them all. Stories of relentless perseverance. As he shattered barriers in a time when many told him a black man would never ascend to command. Yet he rose anyway, earning respect through action and integrity rather than words. And as the stories unfolded, the teenagers, once loud and defiant, found themselves captivated not by tales of war, but by the indomitable spirit of a man who embodied sacrifice and dignity in the face of hatred and adversity. They listened, really listened, until the weight of history settled upon them like a slow dawn, washing away their ignorance and replacing it with a reluctant but genuine understanding. And one by one they stood, their voices shaky but sincere, apologizing, not out of fear of retribution, but because they had finally grasped the meaning of respect, the true cost of freedom, and the legacy Elijah carried on his aging shoulders. Before departing, Sergeant Major Brooks approached the leader of the teens, handing him Elijah's old unit patch with a solemn command. "You want to act like a man? Start by honoring one." A challenge that echoed far beyond the moment, resonating as a call to accountability and growth, while Elijah himself stood quietly nearby, pride veiled beneath tired eyes, feeling the weight of generations behind him, yet also the fragile hope of change stirring in the next generation's hearts. As the Marines saluted their revered elder and disappeared into the gathering dusk, the town was left forever altered, reminded that respect is not a demand to be barked, but a gift to be earned through courage and humility. And in that charged, unforgettable moment, Elijah Freeman proved once more that history is not confined to dusty books or fading photographs, but lives fiercely in the souls of those who walked through hell so others could walk free.